back to the Fourth Way Podcast. In this episode, I had the privilege of interviewing Dr. William Witt. I wanted to speak with Dr. Witt because he has written one of the most influential books that I've ever read on the topic of gender roles in the church. His book, Icons of Christ, is well worth your time to explore. But why did I want to speak with Dr. Witt in regard to a season on propaganda? Well, we recorded this episode just weeks after the Southern Baptist Convention, or the SBC, came out with a lengthy report detailing a plethora of pastors involved in sex scandals and abuse in the SBC over the decades, along with systematic cover-ups. Now, this isn't at all to point at the SBC as being uniquely vile, as the problem exists in many denominations and in our culture in general. But what I wanted to speak with Dr. Witt about was primarily twofold. First, how are certain messages insulated from critique? In regard to complementarianism, we discuss how accusations are levied against those with different views, that they don't take the Bible seriously. They don't believe the Bible is inspired by God. Rather than deal with logic and arguments on the egalitarian side, complementarians make pejorative attacks oftentimes. In fact, just recently, I saw, I think it was on Twitter, that Beth Allison Barr was saying, she was frustrated because she was saying that she can't make any arguments without somebody just saying, well, you don't believe in inerrancy, and you don't believe in the Bible, and they just dismiss her rather than having a discussion with her. Such tactics are indicative of a propagandized culture. Second, in this discussion, we talk about the fruit of complementarianism and whether or not what it produces is indicative of its veracity or falsehood. But more than exploring the issue of complementarianism and ideology and evaluating the epistemology, we talk about power and love and submission in the church. There are a few big ideas in here specifically related to propaganda that I want to hone in just a little bit more. We talk a lot about power and control in this episode. Now, you can't ever forget that propaganda isn't really about an ideology, though a lot of times there is some ideology woven into or explicit to the message of propaganda. But it's not really about the ideology so much as it is about producing particular results and eliciting particular responses. Propaganda cares about the effect. It doesn't care what medium it uses to achieve that effect. In regard to our culture and sexual abuse, or the SBC report that came out, why do so few women report sexual crimes against them? And why do so many male leaders cover up the abuse of women, if both of their preached ideologies seem to encourage the opposite responses? Responses that women should report crimes because they know that those things are evil, or male leaders not covering up and bringing sin into the light. Why are the actions of these groups the opposite of what you think they should be? Well, if propaganda elicits reactions, I think part of the reason is because these groups, all of us, are propagandized in some form or fashion. And propaganda is often much subtler and more difficult to see through than the overt ideology or text. But we're often busy and distracted by taking a look at the overt ideologies that are stated on paper, rather than looking at the fruit that's borne out. So essentially, women know they won't be listened to, and churches subconsciously falter in their idea that women are ontologically inferior, or maybe churches hold ideas that they have to keep the abused hushed up to prevent a stain on the church's reputation. I don't know, there's something there, though. When we look at the discussion on complementarianism and abuse, you can't simply assess the stated ideology. You have to look at the elicited actions and the methods of defense in the discussions that are had. when women aren't coming forward, when male leaders are covering things up, and when theological discussions look like essentially ad hominem attacks, there's propaganda going on here. And that leads to something else that you should look out for. And this is going to come at the end of the episode, so this is going to be important to kind of understand now so that you can kind of also see it come up throughout the episode, but less explicitly. So throughout our seasons, we've talked about things like systemic racism or CRT, and in this episode, egalitarianism. And we discuss how ideas like this are labeled as woke or progressive or, I don't know, Democrat, liberal, whatever you want to put on it. And they're labeled as such in order to dismiss the idea without actually having to deal with the idea. Hitler, in his book Mein Kampf, talks about how this is a strategy that he used when he was assailed by multiple ideological opponents. You know, if you have a particular political view and there are four political individuals who disagree with you, or four groups that disagree with you, somebody might look at that and say, hey, wait a second. If most people disagree with you, then it seems like you might be wrong. It's going to be harder to believe you. But Hitler was a brilliant propagandist, and he recognized a solution to this. If you appear weak when assailed by four enemies, what if you can actually categorize those four enemies and categorize and consolidate them as one common enemy? So it's intellectually and theologically tedious to deal with egalitarians and systemic racism and CRT and inerrancy or infallibility, or, you know, your view of scripture, your view of the atonement, your view on sexuality, all those things. It's very tedious to have to think through and deal with all of those things. So what do? Well, if you don't believe in my view of the atonement, of inerrancy, of sexuality, of you name it, then you're woke. And if you're woke, I don't have to deal with 7 different ideologies. I just have to deal with one ambiguous ideology, this wokeness, whatever that means. It's a genius strategy, but it's a disingenuous one, and it prevents us from having to deal with rational ideas through discourse. And unfortunately, it works. And of course, once the lines in the sand are drawn, and those people over there are woke and we are not, we take on this other aspect of propaganda, which is the polarization, or the Manichaean side. You're either for us or against us. It's either black or white. You either believe the Bible and complementarianism, or you believe egalitarianism and you aren't a Christian. Propaganda creates these simplistic, false dichotomies. It draws the line in the sand not to say, hey, you who are without sin, step up here and throw the first stone. But rather, it draws a line in the sand and begs to be first in line to throw the stone. Polarization and demonization are a significant aspect and often indicative of propaganda. Finally, one other thread that comes up throughout this episode is community. Now, we don't ever really spend a ton of time elaborating on this, but it is very important. Propaganda is propagated through communities, and ideologies are held communally. That's really important to understand. It's hard to change ideas which are held as a part of a community. But while that's true of the formation and holding of bad ideas through propaganda, it's also true of good ideas and the way that good ideas form and are held. The way that we fight propaganda, I think, as we'll discuss more at the end of the season, is through community. Again, we don't really get into specific discussions on this all that much here, but it's something to listen out for and tuck away, because it's going to be something that we come back to throughout the season. So with all that said, and all those things to look out for, let's go ahead and jump right into the episode. let me give you a little bit of background, because I know that in an email conversation, it might be a little bit difficult to kind of understand where I'm coming from. So let me tell you kind of what my thoughts are and where I'm coming from and fill you in. And then my goal is to just ask you some questions and let you do the vast majority of the talking.
Okay.
All right. So I'm doing a season on propaganda. It's something that in the last couple years in particular has seemed to me to be something that's really important to understand in our culture. And, one of the things that's pretty clear is that propaganda is used to maintain control, and a lot of people think that propaganda is just basically people trying to lie or deceive other people, and that does happen in propaganda. But really, it's a lot like the garden and the snake. It's as much truth as possible mixed with as little lying as possible, because the closer something is to the truth, the more easily it's going to go down. So the most effective way, though, that propaganda functions is that it creates a culture or a community that kind of inculcates people with ideas. And so there's a famous, in the smoking campaign, when they're trying to get everybody to smoke, they had a problem getting the women to smoke. Well, there's a famous Torches of Freedom in 1929 where they're like, hey, you guys just got the vote a couple years ago,
right.
And smoking, it's emancipation, it's freedom. Like, women, this is the image that you want. You're a community together, band together.
Right. Yeah. I remember when I was younger and they used to allow tobacco commercials on television, that there were particular products that were specifically geared toward women. Including skinny cigars. I remember those very well. They were cigars that were specific, but it was very clear. Yeah.
Is that like the Cruella de Vil thing,
Well, no, it was just they were cigars that were about the size of a cigarette, size and shape of a cigarette, rather than the traditional big fat cigars that men smoke.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that was a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, in this particular section of the season, I've been talking a lot about how abusers generally abusers use propaganda in regard to the subjectification of women.
Yeah.
And the reason I invited you here isn't because you have an expertise in abuse, which you made very clear, like not at all. You were kind of nervous about that, but the reason I invited you here is because you wrote a book that was very influential for me, which deals with the Christian view of women. And I want to talk about the idea of subjectification of women in the Christian sphere. So if you would just give a brief background about your book called Icons of Christ, and maybe explain how you came to write it and why you thought it was important.
Yeah, sure. And a lot of what you're saying has, since the book has come out, I have begun to experience a kind of pushback that shows me that this culture is very much still alive. I was raised in a church that was, the word that is now used is complementarian. We didn't have that word in those days, but it was very clear that men were in charge. Women were, they had a place to be in subjection to men. Certainly that was the kind of family I was raised in. I wouldn't describe my father as abusive, but he definitely, the word that was used in those days would say that he wore the pants in the family. And even that is a gender specific expression. I left that denomination when I was in my 20s, and there were a number of reasons. But one of the reasons had to do with the equality of women, which I'd come to accept. And I became an Episcopalian, which at that time was a church that was ordaining women. They had just started ordaining women a few years earlier. And in that church, the problem of clergy who were women was just never, it just wasn't a problem. So I didn't have to deal with it for the most part until recent years. And there has been a split that has taken place in the Episcopal Church, but other denominations as well. The Lutherans, the Methodists are getting ready to have something like that going on. And one of the things that we discovered is that many of the conservative people, and by conservative, I'm not talking about politics necessarily, I'm talking about theologically more traditional side, that there were folks who were suddenly retreating back and saying, when did things go wrong? Well, they went wrong when, among other things, we got a new prayer book, and that may not mean anything to you. But we also began ordaining women. And so there was this argument that these two things were connected. And so something that I thought had been settled way back 30 some years ago was suddenly now being brought forward again. There was a woman I knew who I mentioned in the beginning of the book. Her name was Martha Giltonen. She was a professor of pastoral theology at the seminary where I teach. She was an ordained woman. And she was saying, I'm really surprised to hear this. I mean, I've been an ordained priest for 20 some years. I've not encountered this. Now suddenly I'm encountering it again. She asked if I would write something about it to put on my blog. And I was reluctant. I said, look, I'm a layperson. I'm not ordained. I'm not a woman. I think it would be better if you did this. And her response was, and she was correct, that she was not a writer. And she didn't have the historical background and the theological background that I did. She, again, her area was pastoral ministry, how to do the day-to-day kind of thing. So I said, okay, I'll write a few essays. And I began writing essays, and I ended up writing an entire book. And she, unfortunately, got cancer when I was about halfway through writing it, so she never saw it finished. She died. But to keep my promise to her, I did finish it. Addressed a number of publishers, and Baylor University Press agreed to publish it. And I mean, I will say, as far as I know, it is currently the only book out there that covers, specifically focusing on the ordination of women, but covers as much material as I cover. So a lot of the material that I'm looking at is biblical and theological material that's very specific. So there are a lot of books talking about Paul on women. There are books talking about Roman Catholic reasons for ordaining or not ordaining women. And then there's a whole ordination question, which is a different question from, what Paul might say. One of the things I wanted to do was to pull this together and put it in one place. So if you want to find out, you don't have to, I'm going to buy this book on Paul and this book that talks about the Roman Catholic position, et cetera, et cetera. So I wrote that to just sort of pull it all together. And it's been received fairly well for an academic text. The publisher has let me know that it has been one of their best sellers. I get emails on a regular basis from people who thank me for what I've written. But I've also gotten some vicious criticism, including, I mean, some of the reviews of my book. I've been somewhat flabbergasted, saying, my goodness, you're not well informed about the current state of the discussion. You just don't know what biblical scholars have been saying for the last 20 or 30 years, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book. So that's sort of an overview.
Yeah. I actually read your book twice. Once when it was in the PDF, or I saved it as PDFs from your website, and then I bought the book when it came out. So it was extremely comprehensive. And even though you did a Protestant version and kind of a Catholic version in the book, and kind of went through all the arguments, I really appreciated that, because working in an Orthodox context, they're significantly different than Catholics, but it's still very similar. They're more similar to Catholics than Protestants. Yeah,
and in fact, two of the main writers whom I learned from in that section were Orthodox theologians. A woman writer and Orthodox bishop named Callistus Ware. For some reason, the woman's name is slipping me right now, but I read hundreds of books. But yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that. So
I think, like you said, your book is very comprehensive, and you can get some of the things that you say elsewhere, but kind of piecemeal. One of the things that I got from your book that I don't recall getting anywhere else, and I'm sure it probably is somewhere else, but the thing that was really powerful for me, because I also grew up in a complementarian background. I'm still in a complementarian denomination, and it's kind of been ingrained in me that if I question that, then I basically don't believe in inerrancy, and I'm going to be a liberal who accepts homosexuality and abortion, and that whole slippery slope thing. But one of the things that kind of took that burden off of me a little bit was your really powerful argument, which you say you call the argument from tradition is not the traditional argument. Would you briefly outline that argument against traditional complementarianism?
Yeah. Well, this is actually a position that is often taken in these discussions by both. It's more of a Roman Catholic argument to focus on tradition, but complementarians use it as well. And the argument is basically, look, the church has never ordained women. The church has always thought that only men should be ordained. And so if you agree, if you're endorsing the ordination of women, you are also basically rejecting the entire history of Christian faith. And what is missing from this is an actual discussion of the history of how ideas develop. So, and including these folks seem to be unaware of their own history. So if you look at the history of the discussion of why women are not ordained, you will find repeatedly over and over in the tradition is that it has to do with authority, which is a complementarian argument, but it also has to do with capacity. And theologians consistently through the entire history of the church have said that women are less intelligent than men, that women are more susceptible to temptation than men are, and women are highly emotional. And it's for this reason that women can't be ordained, but not just that women can't be ordained, but that women should not have any, do any kind of work that takes place in the public sphere. So there's men's work that has to do with, leaving the house and, I'm going to be a politician, I'm going to be a farmer, I'm going to be a soldier, whatever. And there's women's work that has to do with having children, raising those children. And what this is it's sort of a theological endorsement of that understanding of the roles of the sexes. A lot of that historically has to do with the differences between an industrial and a post-industrial culture. I pulled out a huge pile of my books here, and I realized that the text is going to be backwards because it's a mirror image. But this book that I talk about in my book a lot, called The Redemption of Love, Rescuing Marriage and Sexuality from the Economics of a Fallen World, talks about the changes that have taken place as a result of moving to a post-industrial society, where women are not confined to having lots of children and being home for basic reasons of economics. That in a world of economic scarcity and where most people are working in agriculture, children have to be around women because women have to take care of them, and men are the ones who largely do the heavy lifting. And that's still largely the case in agrarian societies. For example, most of Africa, where I teach, we get a lot of seminarians who come from Africa, and their cultures are still very traditional in that sense. They often are, but they're going through a transition as they are becoming more and more industrialized. So they will have cell phones, but often they will also live in areas that are incredibly remote and isolated. So all of that is connected. One of the things that began happening around the time of the Reformation, but more since then, is the modern world has seen more and more of an equality among people. And we've seen things like the Civil War, American Civil War, and the abolition of slavery here. In England in the 19th century, there were evangelicals who were very much at the forefront at eliminating slavery in the slave trade, a man named William Wilberforce, whom you may or may not have heard of. We've come to realize that racism is a problem. And the notion that working people should have more say about the kinds of jobs that they do, what they're saying in the workplace, the rise of unions. And of course, the freedom and equality of women is also part of this. And as we're now living in a world that's very, very much post-industrial, most people work outside of the home, and it's very common for women to still have work outside of the home as well as men, and people have to worry about daycare and things like that. And that's true among complementarians as well as it is among egalitarians. One of the shifts that happened as a result of this, women got the vote in the United States in the earlier 20th century, the same in other parts of the world. And a shift took place in terms of how traditional Roman Catholics and Protestants talked about these things. They began talking about the equality of women, which was something they had never said before. The Roman Catholic Church made very public statements about this in some of its encyclicals. Modern Protestants have made these statements. And it's interesting that the primary Protestant argument against the ordination of women by complementarians are very emphatic about the fact that they believe women are equal to men. But they talk about a difference of roles, that there are certain roles that men are called to, women are called to other roles, but there's a general equality. What is not being acknowledged when they make those kinds of statements is that this actually is a shift, that 500 years ago, you wouldn't have heard people arguing that men and women are generally equal in every way except there are these different roles. In fact, specifically the traditional argument against the ordination of women had to do with inequality. So that's what that argument is about. So what I argue is that all three of the positions, if you want to call them three, in the contemporary church, whether you adopt the Protestant position against the ordination of women, the Catholic position against the ordination of women, or whether the Catholic or evangelical position in favor of the ordination of women, you are basically operating out of a changed understanding of the relationship between men and women, and that you're acknowledging right off the bat that men and women are fundamentally equal in terms of intelligence and emotional stability. And so for evangelicals, if you don't ordain women, you don't make the argument because women are stupid, which is the argument that would have been made hundreds of years ago. So that's a short summary of that argument.
Yeah, they still might say women are stupid. They just do it in like dog whistle types of ways, and couch it differently.
That there is some truth to that, yeah.
So yeah, and I think the reason that argument was so powerful for me is because church history and tradition is it's not always the clincher for me, but there are a lot of times that I feel like that highlights maybe unhealthy shifts in things where we're trying to be progressive, but we're moving away from something that's rooted in tradition. And so historicity is something that in my complementarian circles was a huge problem for me thinking about throwing off complementarianism. And I think your argument to show, and especially some of the quotes that you have from the ante-Nicene church as well as the post-Constantinian church, it's pretty terrible. And I mean, their reason for holding to whatever you call it, because it's not complementarianism, but it's just terrible.
That's true. A lot of there's a considerable variation. So there are some folks like Albert the Great and John Knox who are quite vicious in the way that they speak about women. And I have those quotations. There are other people who are far more moderate. So I point out that Thomas Aquinas can speak very favorably of the relationships between men and women. He has this beautiful passage that says that the woman was not created from the head of man because she doesn't rule over him. She's not created from his feet because he does not rule over her. She's created from his side because they are bound together by love. It's a beautiful understanding of the relationship between men and women. And also I mentioned Luther it seems to be somewhat of an exception. He says that if there had been no fall, that men and women would have been completely equal. And he has a very positive view of his wife, Katie. But even among people like Thomas Aquinas, when push comes to shove, he says, well, it has to do with a greater capacity for reason among men. And I think that in terms of practical experience, some of this had to do with people's everyday experience, that very few women would have been educated. Very few men would have been educated, but women in particular would have been largely confined to the domestic sphere. So When you have someone who's extremely educated, even someone who's a sexist, like Albert the Great, or I forgot the name, John Knox, the women that they're going to encounter are not going to be very intelligent. Richard Hooker, who's in my own tradition, an Anglican, when he talks about women, he says that more women are Calvinists because women are more susceptible to emotional weakness, and that probably explains why he doesn't think much of Calvinism. The Puritans are the foe, but he thinks that's why so many women are attracted to Calvinism. So there's no question, and I think honesty demands that we just acknowledge that there is a history of sexism in the church.
Yeah, so your argument, I think, takes away the problem of historicity and that kind of bludgeon that's used, and really what it seems to show is that, okay, if you're going to call egalitarians progressives, then you need to also call complementarians progressives, because they're not adhering to the grounding of the early church. But there's still one other hurdle for me in even considering something that's not complementarianism. It was historicity, but then the other thing is, and people like Beth Allison Barr and others who are pushing back in the evangelical sphere are talking about how when I talk about this, you're saying now that I don't believe in the Bible. You're saying that I don't believe that the Bible is the Word of God. You're saying that I don't believe in inerrancy or infallibility. And so this is kind of the second cudgel that's being used to preserve complementarianism. Do you feel like it's a fair fight to use such accusations? Or
well, I don't want to be rude, but to me, it just simply reflects an ignorance. Those of us who are advocating for the equality or ordination of women are not doing so based upon the fact that we think the Bible is wrong. We're doing so based on the fact that we think that this is the central message of the Bible. And one of the reasons I had, so many of authors that I interacted with who were biblical scholars is that they make that argument much better than I can. So my argument, if you read my book, I'm not saying Paul is wrong. I'm saying that people who interpret Paul to say that women should always be subordinate to men and that women cannot teach are themselves, they're mistaken in their reading of Paul. They're especially, I would say, mistaken in their reading of Jesus, who had women disciples. And of course, they're mistaken, I would say, in the reading of Genesis, the creation narrative, which I think is central for understanding of the relationship between men and women. In Genesis, the man and the woman are portrayed as being entirely equal, with the same creation mandate in Genesis 1:28 to rule over and subdue the earth. They're all given equal responsibilities. It is only after sin enters the world that we're suddenly told that the woman's desire will be for her husband, but he will rule over her. That's not portrayed as, nowhere is it said before that it's the man's responsibility to rule over the woman. And this ruling of the man over the woman is indicated as one of the consequences of the fall. In the same way that the man is told he will have to work by the sweat of his brow, that what originally was a kind of harmony between the human beings and creation and between the man and the woman now becomes a disharmony, where there's a conflict between the man and nature. There's a conflict between the man and the woman. And basically what the gospel is largely about is about restoring this harmony that is a result of sinfulness. So that's an overview, but yeah, and I would just say, for people who say that kind of thing, I would just ask them, have you read the scholarship? I mean, have you really read what people, again, I have big fat books here. Philip B. Payne's book on Paul and Women, One in Christ. I think that this is sort of like the definitive study on the subject. And he argues that that the complementarian reading is just mistaken. So if I thought, I'm a systematic theologian, I have a new book coming out this fall that's about not about women at all, but about the doctrine of the atonement. If I didn't take scripture seriously, I wouldn't be teaching theology, and particularly wouldn't be teaching at the kind of place I'm teaching at.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well,
okay,
sorry, go ahead.
I didn't have any idea that I was going to get going, but yeah.
So. No. I appreciate that. I had something in my mind and it just slipped, but I'll come back to it. So historicity and inerrancy or infallibility, those are two big things, and those are more logical things. You can take a look back at history, you can make a case. You can take a look at theology and make a case. But there's also another concept that I think is typically levied at different ideas, and that is the idea of the fruit of ideas. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. And of course, this is going to be a bit more subjective. There's always the no true Scotsman that can come out and say, well, they're not really true complementarians if they do this, or they're not true Christians.
Right, yeah.
Nevertheless, we know that ideas have consequences, and we're talking a couple weeks after the SBC report on abuse just came out. The Catholic Church sex scandal is still raging on, and you still hear more and more people who are kind of coming to light in that. We're seeing Christian leader after Christian leader caught up in sex scandals. Ravi Zacharias for me was a big one. And a lot of these leaders hold really significant positions of power. They're in denominations that view women as functionally, if not ontologically, lesser, even if they say that they don't. And a lot of these groups also seek power and results, right, over integrity, which I think we've seen play out in politics in the last 6 years or so, especially. But regardless of the intention of most complementarians, do you think that a complementarian viewpoint creates the soil in which this kind of abuse is bound to happen and festers and gets covered up and abetted? Or do you think that's not something unique to complement or worse in complementarian ideology?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I taught a course in social ethics last fall, and I did have a couple of weeks on the whole question of abuse of women. We're talking more about sexual abuse than perhaps physical abuse, but all of that was interested going on. And one of the reasons I want to do this is because this has become a major issue in the church. And one of the issues that did come up was the whole question of power. And there was some pushback among what I would say complementarian in the course, who thought that, said, you're saying that, if I'm a complementarian, that I am necessarily an abuser. And I wasn't saying that. But what I will say is this. I mean, and again, I have to be quite honest. I have a particular position. I think that the complementarian position on women is not what Scripture really teaches. But I also do think that, and I also want to be clear about abuse. The problem of abuse it seems to be an inherent problem with men. And not just Christian men. But I think that I'm going to bring up another. I wanted to make sure that I was ready for you. But a guy named Kevin Giles, I don't know if you've heard of him. He wrote a book that, again, I would recommend. All these things have been coming out in the last year or so, called The Headship of Men and the Abuse of Women. And he studies this, and he studied this in some detail. And he looks particularly at the Southern Baptists. Also this Diocese of Sydney in Australia, which is an Anglican diocese, but is complementarian. And he has noticed that there is a correspondence. And looking at the social literature, he said that basically there are two things that you have to have in order to have the abuse of women. One is what he calls a macro culture. That is an overall view that says men have power, men should be in control, and women should be in subordination to men. And in cultures where that understanding is more dominant, abuse takes place more often. So he particularly points out that that among certain cultures, particularly African culture and Central and South American culture, where there's a kind of big focus on what you would call machismo in Central and South American culture, in Africa, where men are very much in charge, there's a more, just in terms of the percentages, there's a higher percentage of abuse of women. If you believe, and it's interesting that the official complementarian position basically overlaps with this characteristic that makes abuse of women more permissible. That is to say, men should be in charge. The second thing that you need in order for abuse to take place is an individual man who often has problems with anger control, who's has low self-esteem, who has views about his need to be in control and to have power, and will often believe that the women in his life are the few people that he can control. And this is often sometimes connected with alcohol. Not all men who are complementarian are abusive. So you might well believe that it is the responsibility of men to be in charge and to run things. And it's interesting that the SBC, Southern Baptist Church, and the Diocese of Sydney, he points out, put out strong statements a couple of years ago against the abuse of women, and argued complementarianism does not abuse women; it protects women. We should not, if you love your wife and you're protecting her, you should not be abusing her at all. But in fact, what seems to happen, and seems to have happened, is that there is a higher percentage, and some of it has to do with a permission that is given. And one of the things that Giles points out is that often Christian men who abuse their wives will appeal to ideas like the Bible says that I am the head. The Bible says that you are to submit, and they will use that as a justification for what they're doing. Now, there is no justification for men to abuse women, and complementarians would say that should not be taking place. And I have known people who don't believe in the ordination of women, who in fact are some of the most loving and caring people I know. One of the things that Giles points out is that many men who claim to be complementarians, when push comes to shove, are very egalitarian in their own home life. And I would say that, in terms of my own experience, I grew up in that culture in which men were supposed to be in charge. My father was a loving, caring person, and I would say that most of the decisions my parents made were pretty much, both of them, had something to say about the matter. And when my mother had a very strong opinion and put her foot down, my father would generally give way. But I do think that this theological position that says that men should be in charge does give certain men permission, and a theological permission to use this to vent their anger against wives or significant women in their lives. The other question, I think, that's not necessarily doing with spousal or family abuse, is the whole question of why so many men in positions of power use that power to sexually abuse women. And that seems to be running. I mean, I think it was probably going on all along, but we just weren't aware of it. I remember, when the Roman Catholic thing was going on 20 years ago, I remember that we're hearing, fellow Protestants saying, this is horrendous, this is awful, and this happens because of, priestly celibacy, and this doesn't happen among us. Well, it's now very clear it is happening among us. In the church of which I'm a member, we've had scandal after scandal after scandal, where clergy who were pastors of large churches um, have been involved in abusive behavior, and even a couple of cases where bishops have had to step down. And again, I'm not speaking from an Anglican point of view. Bishops are basically the higher ups in the authority. So we're certainly not exempt from it. Whether there's a direct connection between, I personally, I don't understand how clergy could get involved in sexual abuse of parishioners under any circumstances, because it's so clearly against what Scripture teaches. Whether that's connected to complementarianism, I could not say, but I do think that sometimes that physical abuse and the tendency to domineer and to use anger to control people can at least find its justification in the idea that men should have authority over women.
Yeah, it's there's I'll have to read that book by, did you say it was Giles was his last name?
Yeah, Kevin Giles.
Kevin Giles, okay.
Giles, and he's been writing about these things for a long time. But he wrote this book just a year or two ago called "The Headship of Men and the Abuse of Women: Are They Related in Any Way?" And it's a 100-page read. You can read it in an hour or two. But he does make a strong argument.
Okay. Yeah, I recently read The Way of the Dragon and The Way of the Lamb, which is a lot about power, and interviewing different Christian leaders, and yeah, it was just very interesting how the use of power and placing yourself above somebody, even if you're in a denomination like your own, which doesn't adhere to complementarianism, you can still. Just like you said, some complementarians really act like egalitarians. Some egalitarians probably really act like...
And I would say that I'm a member of the Anglican Church of North America, and we are a mixed bag on this question. So there are... we're divided into these things called dioceses, which are basically geographical groupings, but not all of them are. And some of them ordain women and some of them do not. But what's interesting is that the sexual abuse does not seem to have confined itself one way or the other. So I don't want to go into details. If people want to do the research, they can find out. But there's been a lot of there have been several cases of prominent figures in the church who've had to be removed from their positions in the last 2 or 3 years because of sexual abuse. Some of it heterosexual, but some of it surprisingly homosexual, which is really odd because the issues of sexuality was one of the reasons the split took place. But I have come to believe, G.K. Chesterton and Reinhold Niebuhr both agreed that original sin was the one dogma that was empirically verifiable, and I think that is the case.
Yeah. So talking about fruits, okay, we just talked about the fruit of complementarianism. I think another big struggle for me is you also have the same accusation levied at Christianity in general, right? So if Christianity was the true religion, I would expect that you would be doing a lot better, like it would work, and you wouldn't be as prone to these sexual deviances, to this abuse of power, and the bad fruit of the church. Even if we say, well, we're only about as bad as the world, still, if we have the Holy Spirit residing in us, we should be doing a whole lot better than the world. And likewise, I also hear this fruit argument levied against, in regard to homosexuality, the church's treatment of view on homosexuality seems to be leading to a lot of self-harm in the LGBTQ community. And so people say, hey, look, if your ideology was really love and good for people and about community, then these people wouldn't be killing themselves because you're critiquing them and you're critiquing their lifestyle. How would you respond to this idea that it's easy to sit here and poke complementarians and say, hey, your system kind of proves itself wrong, sort of, by the way that you have a tendency towards abuse of power, yet the church as a whole seems to have bad fruits, and our views on homosexuality seem to produce bad fruit.
Two different questions here. One, I would say that for people who've really studied history, humanity produces bad fruits. I mean, if you reading the history of the ancient world in particular, this was, the ancient world was a world in which slavery was normal. It was a world in which people were commonly crucified. That's why Jesus died on the cross. The gospel, what I would say about Christianity is that it has made significant changes where it has become dominant, and there are many ideas that we think of as just part of modern culture that are direct results, I think, of Christian influence on modern culture. Modern ideas like democracy and equality, all of those kinds of things, the modern understanding of politics basically comes out of the West, going back to people like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and the Reformation has had a lot to do with this. At the same time, Christians are members of their culture, and traditional, Western culture has carried on a lot of the characteristics of the Roman Empire before it. Christians have sort of accepted a lot of those things as normal. So I would say that the relationship between Christianity and culture has been a mixed bag. I think sometimes a lot of the critique of Christianity is based on a poor knowledge of history. So the new atheists love to talk about how Christians did, all these horrible things, but much of that, in the religious wars and the Crusades and all these kinds of things, much of that is based on just a kind of shallow knowledge of what the history actually was. But there's also no question that Christians have done horrible, horrible things. So, the Reformation, whether you're Catholic or Protestant, people on both sides killed one another. The only group at that time that was arguing for separation of church and state, which, at least in the United States, we accept as normal, were the Anabaptists, and the Roman Catholics and Protestants both agreed that they should be killed. So yeah, there is a whole history, and what I would say, it's a mixture. There's much good, there's much bad. What I would say is that a lot of the changes, and I would also say that changes take place over a period of time. So I talk in my book about, I talk about Martin Luther, who, when the peasants were sort of read what he said about freedom in his book, The Freedom of a Christian, and said, well, then we should be free. And then Luther's response to that was say, no, you misunderstood. This has nothing to do with economics. And he basically encouraged the rulers to put down the peasant revolt. But 200 years later, people like John Wesley were arguing against slavery based on what they read in scriptures. And it was in the 19th century that it was Christians who were largely the leaders of the movement that did away with slavery. I mentioned William Wilberforce in England, the abolitionist movement here in the United States. It's often been Christians who were at the forefront of things like the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. would be an example of that. I would also say one of the real problems, if you want to call it to be a problem, is that success can be problematic in itself. So insofar as Christianity sort of took over Western culture, to be a Western person, European or American, was simply to be a Christian. And I would say that one of the things that at least certain kinds of evangelicals have understood is that you aren't automatically a Christian just because you're part of the culture. And there have been groups who have tried to have a distinctively different kind of social organization that was distinct in many ways. I think, for example, of the Mennonites, for whom I have a great deal of admiration. But overall, to a large extent, yes, because Christians have been part of the culture, they've often accepted many of the characteristics of the culture. You asked me about the homosexuality question in the letter, in the things that you sent me. That's a related but slightly different question. So I say that there's no question that Scripture teaches that sexual expression takes place within the context of heterosexual marriage, that it should be exclusive. One of the messages that our culture sends to people is that you can only be happy if you can find sexual expression in some way, and singleness is not valued in any sense. And that, I think, is problematic. I would also say that one of the things that's happened in terms of contemporary culture as a result of the shifts that have taken place in economics, and again, I mentioned this book by Carrie Miles, is that people no longer have to be married for socioeconomic reasons. So in pre-industrial cultures, people had to have large families because there was that's not necessary now. If you don't want to be married, you don't have to be. You don't have to worry about having lots of children to help you bring in the crops. One of the things that is produced in our culture is a kind of individualism in regard to sexuality that I think is equally problematic to a kind of patriarchy. So I spent about 15 years of my life after I got my doctorate working in the secular world, and I didn't see anything there to attract me, to be quite honest. In terms of the church's way in which it has treated people of same-sex attraction, I think it has often been problematic, and particularly in the last 20 or 30 years, the way that gay people have been made the sort of scapegoat for everything that is wrong with our culture, and the way that Christians have embraced what I call the culture wars. So among conservative or Orthodox Christians, there have been, it's interesting that a really strong antagonism is the only way I can put it toward people of same-sex attraction has often been connected with the same people who are very strongly connected with complementarianism. But there's been another group of people. My friend Wes Hill, who taught at the same seminary where I teach, has been involved in this thing called spiritual friendship that has focused on the idea of same-sex people finding, having friendships, recognizing that not all social relationships between people have to lead to sexual expression, and that the church needs to provide a positive support for people, I would say not just people of same-sex attraction, but also for divorced people, single people who just never get married. One of the problems with complementarianism, it just doesn't know what to do with people who don't fit into the traditional nuclear family.
So I'm thinking out loud here. This might be way off base and a bad conclusion, but as you talk about singles and homosexuals, do you think that, like, I think about the churches that I've attended all my life, there is almost never a meaningful singles ministry or niche or ways that they can express themselves in relationships. And so essentially, if somebody's a homosexual and we expect them to be celibate, but we as a church kind of show them through our lack of singles, ways for singles to plug in, we're essentially affirming that sexuality is a significant part of your identity, and you need to find that.
Yeah. And that also I know a couple of folks who've written recently on the whole issue of friendship. A man named Victor Austin, an Episcopal priest in Dallas who lost his wife to cancer. And he talks about how the church doesn't know how to deal with single people, that he says, he never intends to be married again, but now it's like He's the single man in his 60s, has grown children, has no intentions to get married, but it's like he doesn't fit in. And he talks about the significance and importance of friendship. My friend Wes Hill has also written on spiritual friendship. And he is, if you're not familiar with Wes, he is a gay celibate man. But I do think that one of the things that the church needs to rethink is not just simply how we think about marriage, but how we think about community, about the church as a distinct community from the society around us, and not simply just buying into the values of the culture, about how we provide support for one another, and about how not everyone in the church is going to be married for various reasons. There's some people who have calls to celibacy. There's some people who just never meet that right person, and there's some people who just would not be good spouses or parents. And the church needs to find ways to minister to those folks. We haven't been good at that. So yeah. I had no idea we were going to go down this road, but
sorry if that was a surprise.
Well, my problem is that, if I'm a theologian, you ask me to think about something, I can always say something.
Yeah. I'm a verbal processor sometimes, so I kind of talk to think things through, and as long as people agree not to hold me to what I say in a discussion, I'm good.
I promise I will.
Thank you. So another thing that I want to talk about is the idea of submission, because these power relationships seem to be where there's a lot of opportunity for abuse, and at the same time, the idea of submission, like I think of kenosis in Philippians 2 as probably my favorite passage in the New Testament. It's just beautiful, but as the idea of submission, Jesus Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, and his submission and loving his Father, the Trinity and the intersubmission. It's beautiful, and in the New Testament, where submission is a big deal. We're called to submit to, even it seems on my reading of it, tyrannical leaders or leaders that we don't agree with. Not obedience to them, but submission and respect. Spouses, particularly wives in the Bible, but I would extrapolate, spouses to their partners, and even slaves, which is probably the hardest one for me, but slaves to their masters. How do you deal with the idea of New Testament submission as a message that you can treat appropriately without kind of creating an opportunity for people to wield power? How do you keep this as the Jesus sort of submission, like we submit, versus the use this to bludgeon other people with? Like, how do you view New Testament submission? Let's just leave it open.
Did I have the book here? It's probably on my shelf. Yeah, I do. This is a really good book on that topic. And this plays a role in my book as well, as Christ Submits to the Church by Alan Paget. It's a whole book on that topic. In the book, Paget makes a distinction between the notion of submission as simply power from the top down. And he says that is generally, I would say that's generally the understanding of a lot of people who talk about power in our own culture, or cultures, since you're in Romania right now. And submission as a mutual willing to be servants to one another. And the New Testament model is based on the model of Jesus. That Philippians 2 passage, at the beginning, Paul says, "Take this mind among yourselves, which is in Christ Jesus." So Jesus, who was in the form of God, talk about being in a position of authority and power, emptied himself to become a servant to us. And so the understanding is that the Christian understanding of authority and submission has to be different from the general understanding of those who have power, have their way, and those who don't simply just have to buckle under. it's interesting that the passage that has become so controversial in these discussions, Ephesians chapter 5, where Paul is talking about the relations between men and women, that in the original Greek, Paul has a participle that is translated properly, submitting to one another. And there is no specific, Paul gives no specific command in that passage to the wives to submit. Rather, he says, submitting to one another, wives to their husbands. And then he talks about husbands loving their wives as Christ loved the church. It's really clear when you look at the passage that husbands and wives are being asked basically to do the same thing that Jesus did. But nobody's being asked to do something unique. Where I would say that things get, there's a tendency for people to make a false dichotomy between, on the one hand, you take authority seriously. On the other hand, no one has authority. We all just sort of submit to one another. The notion of authority is something that I think has to exist. Whenever you have more than 2 or 3 people in a group and you want to get something done, you've got to somehow figure out a way to get it done. An example that I've heard used, and I don't know where I got this from originally, but an Amish farmer who's trying to build a barn with a bunch of other Amish farmers, there's somebody who's basically going to be sort of in charge of the project if you want to get it done. But they're Amish farmers, so no violence is going to be involved, but you still have to have some sort of organization. There's a distinction sometimes between authority in and authority over. So there are times in which people exercise authority. I, as a teacher, exercise authority over my students that presumably is based on expertise. I have a PhD, they don't. I've been studying this stuff for years. They haven't. They're here to learn from me, although I certainly, want them to contribute to the discussion and hope that there's mutual learning. But in the end, I'm the one who gives the grade and they don't. But I think that does mean, though, that as in a Christian setting, that the way that I teach has to be different from the way, for example, that when Mark Twain talks about, when he was, in Tom Sawyer, the teacher who whacks the kid with the stick because the kid steps out of line. Another aspect of submission. So there are going to be people in authority, no question about that. You're in a mission organization, I'm assuming.
Correct.
So there are probably some people that you report to. And if you were to if you were to suddenly just they found out you were just spending all of your time at the local discos or bars or whatever, and just really enjoying yourself, and you weren't doing anything that you were called to Romania to do, except really enjoying being a tourist, there might be a telephone call or something and say, we don't, but you also, I'm assuming, because you were in another country, you have a certain amount of autonomy where people aren't looking over your shoulder all the time. So, yeah, I would say there's a relationship between submission and authority. As I see it, at least part of the Christian understanding is that no authority is permanent. So I might have an authority in one area. So when I'm teaching, I have authority over my students. If I have a student who's a police officer, and I get in the car and I go speeding out of the parking lot, even though that student could pull me over and give me a ticket, and I could say, "Excuse me, Mr. Jones, I'm your professor. You're a student in my class. You can't give me a ticket." And the professor would say, "No, you can give me a bad grade in class if I don't turn an assignment. But when I'm a police officer and you're driving the car, I'm the one who's in charge." So this idea of different authorities in different spheres, something that is connected with. There's a Reformed theologian has written a lot about this in terms of what they call sphere sovereignty, as have Roman Catholics when they talk about something called subsidiarity. But the point is that people exercise authority in different areas. Your authority should be restricted to your area of competence in that area, and it's not also necessarily always going to be permanent. So parents have authority over children, but those children grow up eventually. In a workplace, there's going to be a person who has a certain, there's a hierarchy of authority, who's going to have a certain authority over people over them. but ideally, that should not be an absolute authority. There should be communication. Other people, and to the extent that people in authority don't listen to those who are their subordinates, that's often when problems take place.
So I think maybe the hard part in New Testament submission is that, I'm completely following with what you're saying, but and maybe this is a more modern Western thing, because we're recording like a little bit over a week out from Independence Day in the United States,
right.
And revolution, and well, you lost your authority because it's unjust, like what you're doing, is the idea. And when I think of tyrannical leaders or bad spouses or slave masters and being asked to submit to them, that's hard for me as an American to track with, because it seems like they've lost their authority. So that's where I'm sort of confused with the submission.
Yeah, well, let me put on my ethics hat. I would say, first of all, the Bible just doesn't simply say submit to those who are in authority. So the same, Paul talks in Romans I think it's chapter 13, about paying taxes, and that the person, that the magistrate does not bear the sword in vain. And so he is talking about there's a sense in which Christians need to submit to these pagan authorities who are over them. At the same time, Paul ended up dying because he did not submit to a pagan authority when it came to the gospel. The same New Testament that does contain that passage in Romans also contains the book of Revelation, where the Roman Empire, presumably is who I think in terms of context is the writer of Revelation is talking about, is portrayed as the great beast that God is going to destroy, and Babylon the Great is a sort of the social personification of that. The book of Daniel shows Daniel resisting an authority, and in books that are not in the Protestant canon but are in the Roman Catholic canon, in between the two testaments, the books of Maccabees are actually about a revolution that Jewish leaders basically led against Antiochus Epiphanes, who was this Egyptian ruler who came in and tried to impose his way on them. So there have been historically grounds which Christians have sometimes rebelled against authorities. And people like Augustine and Aquinas lay out what have been called principles of just warfare, in which you lay out under what circumstances can you fight a war, but also lay out circumstances under when should a just ruler be overthrown. And Aquinas actually goes so far as to say that if a just ruler commands you to do something that is inherently immoral, you are obligated to disobey. So the question isn't, do we just simply submit to people because they're in charge? There are times when we can't, but there's also the matter of how one goes about it. So one of the questions that divides Christians has to do with, is violent revolution ever permissible? And some Christians have said, no, all you can do is offer nonviolent resistance as much as possible and be willing to be martyrs. And others have said, no, there are times when you can overthrow the government if need be. You're in a country right now that I'm sure you're familiar has a history of having to overthrow an awful dictator that was just a couple of decades ago. So I would say that there is both grounds within Scripture and within the Christian tradition to say that there are times when violence can be used against unjust authorities. And I'd mentioned William Wilberforce, who was a member of Parliament and was instrumental in terms of overthrowing the slave trade. But one of the things that happened as a result of what he did was that the British Navy used its power to go out and capture slave ships and to basically enforce their will on the high seas. And probably if they had not done that, if they just simply said, we don't like slavery, but we're not going to do anything about it, nothing would have happened. So I'm not a pacifist. I was putting on as much as I admire Mennonites, but yeah, I do think there can be times in which authorities, simply because they're authorities, have to be resisted. And I would also say, in terms of the church now, insofar as abuse is taking place, the church has a moral responsibility to do something about it. I think that one of the reasons why the Catholic Church was created such a scandal is that it was, these things were brushed under the rug, and there were people who covered it up. I think that, we'll have to see what happens with the Southern Baptists, but it looks as if, there's this new report that came out that there were people who were covering up and protecting people who were clearly abusing, which is shocking. But yeah, so I mean, one of the dangers, I think, when people read scripture is just take an isolated passage and assume that this is an absolute for which there can never be any exceptions. And I think it's better to understand what scripture gives you as general principles, but recognizing that not everything is going to work in every situation. So in terms of submitting to governmental authorities, I would say yes, generally, as long as you're not being asked to do something that is immoral, and it promotes the common good. But there are times, at least according to the church tradition, that says no. There's some times when you have to say no. In the United States, I would say that the civil rights movement in the 1960s was a point at which a nonviolent movement rose up against what was going on here in the States in terms of segregation, and said this has to end, and was in the long run successful. And similarly in apartheid in South Africa, eventually that was sort of done away with in a way that was largely nonviolent, but when people just basically said, we're not going to go along with this anymore.
Right. I've got one more question for you on the books.
Okay.
And I find it a little bit sort of ironic, I guess, that, in Paul's day, and you point this out, you talked about Ephesians 5 a little bit earlier, and in your book, you kind of point out that Paul was really being countercultural in elevating women, whereas today, my group feels like we're being countercultural by not, I don't want to say not elevating them, but feeling like this idea of liberation is beyond liberation. It's not what's good. Anyway, so would you talk a little bit about the idea of Paul's elevation of women, or the New Testament's elevation of women in general, and just how sometimes that message is used to try to suppress women today, like, keep silent in the church and that kind of stuff. Whereas if you read it through the lens of Roman culture, really it's not pushing women down, it's lifting them up.
Yeah, I mean, it really does help to know a little bit about the cultural background. So one of the books that I talked about in my own book was by a man named David De Silva, who talks about Mediterranean culture as being a shame-honor culture. And how in a shame-honor culture, again, it's hierarchical, it tends to be very patriarchal, but it's also very family-oriented. And one of the worst things that people can do in a patriarchal honor culture is to bring shame on their family, which is, so not bringing a shame on your father is most important. The Bible, again, the several books I mentioned in my book, like Paget and others, constantly show how Jesus himself subverts the honor culture. So an example of that would be the story of the prodigal son. What the prodigal son does when he comes to his father and says, I want my inheritance, he's essentially saying to his father, I wish you were dead. He then goes off and lives among pagans, and he reaches a point where he's so low that he's actually a caretaker for pigs, which for a Jew was as low as you could get. When he reaches a state of absolute, as low as he can get, he decides to return home, And he tells his father, make me one of the servants. To which the father then responds instead and says, no, we're going to kill the fatted calf. We're going to give you a robe. We're going to give you a ring. The father acts in a way that is entirely subversive of that shame, honor culture. In any Mediterranean village, he would have been shamed. This son would have come back, and a typical father would have said, I don't know you. I just own you. You are dead to me. But Jesus says this is how the Father, God our Father, treats us as sinners. The story of Mary and Martha. Martha's angry with Mary because she's not doing what would be the appropriate work for a woman in that culture. She's listening to Jesus rather than helping, with the dishes in the kitchen or whatever. And there's lots and lots of stories like that where the honor culture is subverted. People look, unfortunately, at there are basically 3 verses in all of Paul that keep getting dragged into this over and over again. One is the Ephesians verse, which is taken out of context to assume that only women are submitting without recognizing that Paul says submitting to one another in the Greek. The second is this passage in 1 Timothy, where Paul has a long discussion of what people are doing in church, and he says women should not speak in church, but they should be silent. In the context, if you go back a few chapters earlier in chapter 10, Paul is talking about whether or not women should wear some sort of head covering when they are leading worship. So the very fact that Paul is talking about women leading in worship would have been something really unusual in that culture. What he's talking about later is what appears to be various people, not just women, who are engaging in disruptive activity in the church. So he says that people who are speaking in tongues, only one of you at a time. And then he says this weird thing, presuming that he actually said it, and we'll get to that in a second. He's basically saying to women, if you have questions, ask your husbands at home. I think what's going on is that Paul is not saying there should be some sort of absolute silence by women in church, because a few chapters earlier, he talked about women speaking in church. He's just basically saying, apparently there must have been women who were disrupting the service. And he's saying, don't do that. In the First Timothy passage is the other one where Paul says something about women shouldn't teach or exercise authority over a man. That single verse is often, again, taken out of context. How it should be translated is not exactly clear. People argue about whether it's Paul is saying that women should not exercise authority in the sense of trying to dominate or whatever. It's clear from the context that he's talking about behavior by both men and women that are creating problems in church. So he says that men should not, he talks about, there obviously should pray without anger, which presumes that men are being angry. And it seems to me, again, that in the context, he specifically is talking about women who are doing something that is disruptive in some way. Throughout the pastoral epistles, Paul is talking about false teachers and people who are creating problems within the church. But if you read the rest of the pastoral epistles, when Paul talks about women, again, this book by Payne is really interesting. He lists the requirements for male elders and deacons. And then when he talks about what women are doing, if you make a comparison of the Greek, he uses the exact same terms. So Paul is basically saying that women, he's wanting women to have important roles in the church. As I read that passage, he's particularly addressing one particular issue that is local to that church. Sometimes people say, yeah, but he refers to Eve, but in the context, he's talking about Eve's deception. And so unless Paul is saying that women are naturally subject to being deceived, which no one wants to say, and which I don't think Paul is saying, he's addressing a particular problem, and he's using Eve as an example. He's basically saying to these women, don't make the mistake that Eve made, who was deceived by the serpent. Don't be deceived by these false teachers. So again, I think in Paul in Romans, last chapter of Romans, I think it's 16, I talk about this in the book as well. he addresses that church and he mentions all of these figures, a great many of whom are women. I think he mentions 10 different women. So it's very clear that Paul had women who were involved in his ministries. Lydia in the book of Acts is just simply described as the woman in whose home the church meets. No men are mentioned. It's always Lydia. And then, of course, Priscilla and Aquila, if you're familiar with that couple, her name is always mentioned first. There seemed to be some sort of missionary couple. So it seems to be that overall, Paul has women very, very much involved in his communities, in the same way that Jesus also had women who were disciples of his and following him around, and whom he gave a kind of role to and importance that they would not have had in the culture at that time. Unfortunately, these 2 or 3 verses about which there's a lot of questions about of how to interpret them, aside from simply the fact that women are being addressed. But people are like, what's going on in these passages? Is Paul telling, in 1 Corinthians 10, is Paul telling women they should wear their hair in a certain way? Is he telling them should have a head covering? Or is perhaps he's not saying that at all? And scholars have argued about these things forever, but they focus on these 1 or 2 verses rather than looking at how does Paul talk about women throughout his letters. And it's very clear that Paul had women who were his partners in ministry. And he valued them. So again, I would say these folks who basically saying that women should not ever have any roles of leadership, that they should just simply submit to men and do what they're told, are reading the New Testament very selectively. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's all that I have for you, and I know that it. We didn't really. I think we avoided you talking about abuse and that kind of stuff, and we didn't talk about it like we were experts or anything, and we didn't even really talk that much about propaganda specifically. I'm gonna create an intro for this and kind of highlight some things, but the conversation was very helpful for me because having read a bit on propaganda to this point. I think there are some big things to be able to pull out.
Yeah. And again, I would recommend this book by Giles on the headship of men and the abuse of women, because he talks about that to a certain extent. I would say that I have encountered, since my book came out, responses that I would describe as propaganda. That is, reviews of my book that actually misrepresented what I had said, and then accused me of believing things that I didn't believe. And then because the church does not want these kinds of things among their leaders, I'm a problem. So I will say that I'll just mention there was something came out just a couple of weeks ago by some gentlemen in my church who are doing a podcast on a regular basis. And they talked about the fact that we had just gotten a new seminary professor in our church. And one of these gentlemen said, yes, but you need to be aware that there are these 2 teachers there who, or the word that he used are totally woke. And so I could not recommend anybody coming to that seminary. And the 2 people he were talking about were myself and another person who had defended women's ordination. And I have to confess that I've been, in the last couple of months, I've gotten emails concerned that were we teaching things like critical race theory and worried about being woke. This has all been very new to me. I didn't even know what woke meant until about a year ago. I never even heard of critical race theory. But it does seem to be the case that in some of the battles that are going on right now in the culture, and unfortunately the church has embraced some of this, that arguments that are being used in the secular culture to debate in terms of political disagreements. And you mentioned things that have been going on in the culture for the last 6 years. I would say the Christians are picking up on this and using it against fellow Christians, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, that highlights 2 of the big things. So if you ever get a chance to read, I'm sure you have your own reading list that's probably a mile long, but Jacques Ellul, 60 years ago, wrote a book called Propaganda, and also the Technological Society. Both of them go very well together. But
the reason I'm smiling, because the one thing I was going to say before I left, if it didn't get said, I was going to ask, have you ever heard of Jacques Ellul? And have you heard of his two books? And you just mentioned the two of them. So yeah, Jacques Ellul is a wonderful, wonderful person. Somewhat forgotten about these days, unfortunately. He was much better known. When I was a young man, he was one of these people who had been important and was still alive, but died, but he's largely been forgotten, and I would highly recommend those two books. So
yeah, he's so prescient. I mean, he could have been writing today, and it's just mind-blowing. But the thing that you just mentioned, he identifies a number of different things, but the idea of being Manichaean, the idea that there's very black and very white. Yeah, we've experienced this. We've had some churches threaten us based on, just a Facebook post here or there, critiquing a political individual that, just a warranted critique of like, hey, like this isn't right. Let's call this out, or whatever. Yeah. So we've had threats because you're either all in or you're all out. And then there's another one that Ellul identified, and also reading Hitler's Mein Kampf was helpful. And Ellul covers a lot of things too. But Hitler talks about. He said, "Hey, look, I've got four enemies that are coming against me." And he said, that's going to make me look bad because I've got 4 versus 1. And so he says, the trick is you lump them all into one category, and you find some unifying thread, and now you only have one enemy. And so I think what you're seeing with the idea of wokeness is, I don't have to deal with your complementarian arguments. You're woke, right? And I don't have to deal with the issue of race because you're woke. There's one idea, and I can dismiss that idea because it's only one enemy.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's absolutely, and it's incredibly frustrating. I mean, like I said, I taught a course on social ethics last fall in which we dealt with issues of sexuality, abuse in the church, politics, racism, all of these various issues, each of which have to be looked at and dealt with separately. But everything in that course we covered can simply be dismissed as, well, that's wokeism. And also, I mean, it is important, I think, that people are able to have conversations in which there's give and take. A friend of mine, I'm sorry I keep throwing these books out, but a friend of mine named David Coercive has written a book called Political Visions and Illusions. He taught political science at Redeemer College in Ontario until he retired. And a central theme of that book is the difference between ideologies, similar to propaganda, and genuine politics. He argues that what characterizes ideologies is that there's always some single viewpoint that is espoused through which everything else is interpreted. And ideologies are essentially, he says, also idolatry, because they are given the power to do things that only God should actually be able to do. And the nature of genuine politics always involves back and forth discussion, compromise. And it seems to me that one of the real problems that we're dealing with these days is a lack of genuine politics, a lack of a willingness of people to sit down and say, let's have a discussion about this. If you hold this particular view, which I don't understand, explain it to me as well as you can, and I'll see if I can understand it. And perhaps we might not end up agreeing, but at least we should be able to understand each other better, and perhaps we might end up changing each other's minds somewhat. And again, if we're the church, our political ideologies and positions on various things have to always be subordinate to the fact that there's only one Lord, and that's Jesus Christ. And the church is always the church. It's not simply one more political community among others. And so it needs to be distinct from the political communities of either our countries or surrounding cultures, or even whatever the latest social movement has to be that we might be tempted to embrace or not embrace.
Yeah, that reminds me of. So I'll make this my last question because I'm sure we could keep coming up with comments. So last question, and then you can answer it, and we'll say bye. But one of the things that has struck me more and more over the years in regard to this idea of like democracy and discussions, right? So the goal of a democracy should be to come to an understanding, versus what it is now is, hey, if I can just garner 51% of the votes, then I get my agenda taken care of because we domineer you. Because democracies really, Habermas argues that democracies are really coercive, right? Because it's majority ruling over a minority, which is what it essentially has become. But in the early church, it seems like we've arrived there also theologically in evangelicalism. Because when I look at the early church, I remember it was on the resurrection of the soul. I think it is Nazianzus or Nyssa. I forget which one. But I was reading it and I was like, that sounds like something a universalist would say. And you go and you start doing research and you're like, oh, there were universalist church fathers, and there were church fathers who believed in conditional immortality and or annihilationism, and just different perspectives on women and different perspectives on the atonement, like all different kinds of things. They seem to have very diverse views, yet were in general able to get along and view each other as brothers and sisters in Christ. It feels like that's somewhat democratic, whereas today it feels like extremely exclusive. Like, I'm in my denomination, we have our theology, we're true believers. You guys, I don't know about because you believe X. Do you have any thoughts on whether it's democracy and liberalism versus power and coercion, or theology in the church, and how the church seems, to me at least, to have been able to hold contradicting views in tandem in brotherhood versus where we are today? Do you have any thoughts on that, or am I off base?
Well, you just raised a whole lot of ideas. One of the things that Coercive talks about in his book, I mentioned him earlier, is the significance and importance of pluralism in a culture. And that's something I think that as a culture we're having real problems with. There's some, I think, geographical and ethnic changes that are taking place in not just in the United States, but in other Western cultures, as a once predominantly white culture is now finding itself surrounded by more immigrants of various kinds. And this is, I think, often made people uncomfortable. But there's a question: can we learn to get along as a culture, to recognize that a culture can be composed of, like here in the United States, ethnically Anglo-Saxon people, but also in the Southwest, many Hispanic people, African Americans, more and more Asian Americans. And that's something that at least there's a movement in the culture right now that seems to be like a fearful that if ethnically European people do not continue to be in control of things, that's going to be problematic. So, and that is entirely contrary to the gospel. There's only one God; He's created everyone. It's interesting that the Pentecost is the undoing of the Tower of Babel, where all of these different languages are spoken and people hear the gospel being preached in their own languages. And Paul himself was a great disciple to the Gentiles. So the church has to be inclusive of everyone, ethnically. In terms of theology, denominationalism is a problem. You mentioned Habermas, in that it has enabled us to find like-minded people and ignore everybody else. So my approach to theology is very ecumenical. which is why I talk to both Catholics and evangelicals in my book. My book that's coming out on the atonement is looking at Eastern Church Fathers, medieval Catholics like Thomas Aquinas, Protestants across the board. So yeah, I think that the church, I think that we need to be willing to and talk to one another. And I think that there has been largely a shift among evangelicals in last generation, broadly speaking, to being more ecumenical in a lot of ways. But some of what's going on is, I think, a pushback against this because it's viewed as leading toward liberalism or whatever. And I see that in my own denominations. But
yeah, you mentioned being ecumenical. That's one of the words we used in a newsletter that we wrote and got our hands slapped by one of our supporting churches because they didn't like that word.
That's too bad.
Yeah, it's Jesus' command that by this that they'll know that you're my followers, that you love one another. I guess that just means Presbyterians. It doesn't mean everybody else.
So now I didn't realize you were a Presbyterian.
Yeah.
Some of my best friends are Presbyterians. My friend David Koizis, I mentioned, he's actually Dutch Reformed, but that's skipping a jump away.
Yeah, I've just found so much value in so many different denominations because I am a pacifist. So Presbyterian pacifists, those don't really exist, but I guess I do. So I identify a lot with Mennonites in some ways, Reformed theology in some ways, Orthodox. They're so much more holistic than our focus on the atonement as transaction. I love the Orthodox, and having learned from them the idea of the life of Christ and Trinitarianism is more robust. I just think there's blind spots in denominationalism, and I like being ecumenical. So.
Well, when my new book comes out, we'll have to have a talk about that at some point, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I look forward to it. When does it come out?
October.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to it. Again, I appreciate your willingness to take this time out of your day.
Okay. I realize I'm looking at your window. It's very dark outside, so you probably should be in bed.
Yeah, it's 11:30. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I apologize for keeping you so long. I really have enjoyed this conversation. I'm glad that you invited me. And I don't know whether we'll have any contact in the future, but I would hope that sometime we can bump into each other again. This has been a real joy.
Okay. Well, if you're in Romania or ever want to visit, just let me know.
Okay. Well, that probably won't happen, but
right.
I have right now. Last few years, I've had many people trying to get me to go to Africa because we have so many students from there. Yeah. But like I said, you're the only person I met in Romania, and I can say what I can say now is that all the Romanians I've met, although you're a missionary, are just wonderful.
Yeah.
So,
well, I am originally from Pennsylvania, which is where you teach. So
it is, yes. Which part of Pennsylvania?
Lebanon, Hershey area.
Yeah. Okay, so you're more the middle of the state then,
right? Yeah.
Whereas I'm as close as you can get to Ohio without. If I make a mistake and make a left turn, I suddenly find myself in Ohio.
Yeah.
But yeah. Well, have a good evening, or I shouldn't say evening. Have a good night. Get some sleep.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
That's all for now. So peace. And because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.